Thank you so much. Like Dirk just said, my name is Joey Van Mater. A question you might have is, why is a guy with an American accent with a Flemish last name studying at a Dutch university in Northern Ireland to talk to you about volunteering, which is fair. During the pandemic, we all got new hobbies. My dad started making sourdough bread. And what my therapist said was a super healthy, normal way to cope. I started a PhD and moved to Europe and did that. So I'm now at the Center for Philanthropic Studies in Vrije in Nederland, the Giving of the Netherlands study at the Free University of Amsterdam. My research is focused on the development of civic identities among young people, so how young people become the kind of person who want to volunteer, who want to help the community, who want to be civically engaged, and the processes around that. The emails that Dirk didn't tell you about were about 2 years ago with very specific pointed questions about the sampling frame and response rates in the ARK surveys. And so I've been using this data for about 2 years, and ARK really does have excellent practices around open data and making sure that the data are open and available to anyone who wants to use them, which is both helpful in the policy sense, but also helpful for social scientists from around the world, or at least from Amsterdam, who would like to use these. This work and my being here is sponsored by, in part by the European Consortium for Sociological Research, so thank you to them. And if anyone else would like to write me a check to do research, or frankly for any other reason, come find me afterwards. So today I'm going to be talking about volunteering, and I'm going to be thinking about volunteering as a life cycle. So thinking about, why do youth volunteer? Do they volunteer at all? Why do they volunteer? Where do they choose to volunteer? And what are their experiences when they do that? And so we think of this as a life cycle because what are your experiences then goes back into whether or not you choose to volunteer in the future. But one big question is, why should we care at all? Volunteering sounds good, but it's a community activity, but why should we spend our time thinking about volunteering and youth volunteering specifically? First of all is service. Obviously, when you're volunteering for someone or for an organization. And youth specifically are a valuable source of this kind of community service. They have generally more time than do adults, especially adults with children. They have different schedules than adults do, and they are open to a lot of different interests in a way that adult volunteers are generally tracked by the time that they've reached that level of maturity. Another area is socio and emotional health. We know, especially among youth, having peer groups and working together in peer groups rather than say in an academic environment can lead to better socio-emotional health outcomes. Experience, building a CV, having opportunities to demonstrate and apply knowledge that you have while learning is important. And then the last two kind of go together in terms of health and future volunteering. Having volunteered in the past is an excellent predictor about whether or not you're going to volunteer in the future, especially if you've had good experiences, positive experiences. And in terms of health, there isn't a lot of evidence for youth being healthier if they're volunteering, but there is exceptionally good evidence showing that older adults and elderly are much better off both mentally and physically if they're in the habit of volunteering, even when you correct for things like socioeconomic status, employment, and things of that, like that. So if you get in the habit of volunteering as a youth, you're more likely to volunteer in the future. You get all of these benefits, and then there's an additional health benefit later on in life if you continue in that level of volunteering. And so today we're going to be talking about youth volunteering, and we're going to use LGBT or same-sex attraction and kind of queer identities as a lens to think about this volunteering life cycle or getting into the habit of volunteering. And one of the reasons that lesbian, gay, or bisexual identity can be an interesting lens to look at youth volunteering is it's a cross-cutting identity. And in the case of Northern Ireland, cross-cutting identities would be an identity that is shared without respect to religious communities. So it's being LGBT is kind of like sexual orientation, gender identity, things like hobbies or interests that are sprinkled throughout the population rather than divided along religious lines. And so we're going to be looking at equality of opportunity in terms of volunteering, the motivations for volunteering, where young people choose to volunteer, and the experiences they have relative to whether or not they experience same-sex attraction or hold a lesbian, gay, or bisexual sexual orientation. And so just to talk about kind of the demographics that we're looking at here. We're using the 2017 Young Life and Times, which is when the most recent time that the volunteering module has been included. It was in split ballot design, so we get to use about half of the sample size received questions on volunteering behavior. But I want to talk about first why lesbian, gay, and bisexual identity or same-sex attraction might be important specifically. Not just a cross-cutting identity, but a very important cross-cutting identity, especially for youth volunteering. So this is showing, and the text is a little bit small, but this is showing over time, starting in 2013 and going all the way through the 2020 wave of the surveys for men on this side and women on this side. The number of, the percentage of individuals who identify some level of same-sex attraction. So kind of all the non-straight categories, levels of attraction. And so what we can see is there's definitely growth in the number of young people, 16-year-olds, that have identified some level of same-sex attraction. And the majority of that growth is among women very recently. So going back to the 2013 survey, about 10% of women identified some level of same-sex attraction. In the most recent survey in 2023, it's closer to 30%. There is some level of growth among men in terms of same-sex attraction, but when we see these larger trends, it's being driven by changes in what women are reporting. And this matches a lot of data, not just in Northern Ireland, in the United States, all of Western Europe. There's been larger and larger numbers of youth, and specifically young women, who are identifying either as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, or some level of same-sex attraction, depending on how the question is asked. And so when we think about differences in volunteering behavior, if we see differences among lesbian, gay, or bisexual youth, that's a growing demographic. So if we see, for instance, spoiler alert, that they are less likely to volunteer overall, that's going to be a growing demographic that's less likely to volunteer. And so this is an important part of future planning, is thinking about who are the people that hold this identity, and what is this growing demographic doing? So we have about 600 young people that are part of the survey. These are all cisgender respondents, meaning that transgender, non-binary folks are not included in this data, even though the Young Life and Times collects data on non-binary and trans identities. It's a very, very small number of respondents, and including them in this data would kind of cover up more of their experience, because their data would not contribute very much to the overall statistical power that we're working with. And so when we're thinking about those identities, we want to make sure that we're not conflating them. So they're not included here, but we are looking at any youth that only report same-sex attraction, so straight men and women, the folks we're going to be looking at today who do report some level of same-sex attraction, and then there's also a small group that are included in the broader study, but that we won't be looking at the results today, of individuals that haven't reported any level of attraction, sexual attraction in the past. So the first thing we want to ask is, are they volunteering at all? Who's volunteering? And so that's this first graph that we look at here. I say we, I didn't actually collect the data. Young Life and Times asks about formal volunteering and informal volunteering. Formal volunteering means you're volunteering with an organization, so that might be your school, that might be a religious group, that might be a healthcare facility or an elder care facility, and then informal volunteering, which we see is much less common. Only about 20% of young people reported informal volunteering, which is doing something independently. So that might be working in an informal neighborhood group to clean up the neighborhood or to care for an elderly neighbor. But what we see overall when looking at this by sexual orientation, we see that overall, both formal and informal volunteering here at the end is less likely. Gay, lesbian, or bisexual youth are about 40% less likely to report volunteering at all in the past year, and that's driven mostly by formal volunteering. So only about 37% decrease in the propensity to volunteer in a formal setting. And again, we care about this kind of overarching piece because this is a growing demographic. So if we were to see this trend in, if we see increasing levels of identification of same-sex attraction or non-straight sexual orientation, at the end, if we see those numbers increasing and no change in this disparity, we would see the overall pool of volunteering, especially among young people, decrease over time. So the other thing we might look at is motivations for volunteering. So why do folks report that they are volunteering? So looking at this graph, this is telling us anything greater than 1 is telling us that you're more likely to report that motivation if you identify some level of same-sex attraction, and then anything less than 1 is going to tell us that you're less likely to report that motivation if you identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And then the bars around it are just kind of how confident we are in the number that we have there. So what we see here is that making friends is kind of disproportionately a reason that lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth cite for wanting to volunteer. And then kind of going in order of disproportionality, it's making friends because the cause was important to me. I want to improve things or help people. I want to learn or use new skills. It'll help me build my CV, or it'll help me for my future career. Friends or family also volunteer. I was asked to help by someone I know, or it's part of my religious or philosophical beliefs. And so we can kind of see, like, at the two ends, making friends, you're more likely to cite that if you are gay, lesbian, or bisexual, and religious or philosophical beliefs are at the very bottom. But I think the rank order here also tells a story in terms of networks. So you're more likely to say you want to make friends through volunteering if you're gay, lesbian, or bisexual. But looking at the very bottom, my friends and family also volunteer, or I'm asked to help by someone I know. Those are kind of ways to maintain your social network. And so what we see is maintaining your social network through volunteering is a more important part for straight young people, whereas expanding your social network is a more important motivation for gay, lesbian, and bisexual young people. So Next, we can look at locations for volunteering. So when young people do volunteer in formal settings, where are they going? And it's going to be the same story here. The farther we are to the right, the more likely that was cited by someone who's lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and then farther to the left would be more likely to be cited by someone who is not. This is perhaps the most obvious graph that has ever been made, in the sense that the least likely for lesbian, gay, or bisexual individuals are volunteering at church or religious organizations or within sports or athletic organizations. That, I think, fits pretty well within kind of the broader stereotype. But in the Northern Irish context, that's also an important thing to note, because those are also two very segregated areas of life. So sports activities, church and religious, obviously based on the community from which you come, but also schools are at the top of the list there, which are also highly segregated areas. But the ones right below, which are more likely if you identify as LGBT, animal welfare, environment and heritage, those are kind of potentially less segregated areas. So there's not, as far as I know, a Catholic dog shelter and a Protestant dog shelter and other dog, So in thinking about, there might be. You can tell me. You can let me know if there are. But in thinking of kind of environmental care as well in that area. And then the final thing that we want to look at in terms of the empirical evidence are volunteering experiences. So this is whether or not, again, more likely if you're LGBT, less likely on the left. And so the two things that are highest on the list disproportionately are you're having more contact with people from minority ethnic backgrounds and having more contact with people of different religious groups if you're LGBT. And kind of the very bottom part is feeling of appreciation by the organization that you're working for, the recipients of your work. And so if we're thinking about wanting to bring communities together, if you're LGBT, volunteering is more likely to get you that outcome. You're more likely to be working with people from a different ethnicity or a different religious background. But if you're LGBT, you're also less likely to feel that you are appreciated by the organizations that you're working with, or that you can cope with the assignments that you've been given, or that you've received adequate training. So when we're thinking about the things that are kind of in the direct control of volunteering organizations, the training, the assignments, the appreciation that folks feel, those are all lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth are less likely to feel that those were appropriate during the time that they were volunteering. And if we think back to the life cycle of volunteering, if the things that are in direct control of these formal organizations that are organizing volunteer work, if LGBT or LGB respondents or young people are feeling like they're getting less out of it and less appreciation, even if they are having these, increased friend networks, increased contact with different religious groups, kind of these diversity and engagement things that we might see as positive outcomes as researchers and policymakers, their experiences are actually not as positive, and they're not reporting as positive outcomes as their straight counterparts. So when we think about kind of the conclusions that we can draw from all of this, on the research side, we see that lesbian, gay, and bisexual young people are less likely to volunteer overall. And we really should be caring about that specifically because it's a growing demographic for our pool of volunteers. If we see this pattern continue in terms of both having slightly less positive outcomes from their volunteering, but also being a growing part of the population, over time we might see a decrease in the level of youth volunteering in the total pool, and also a decrease in the LGBT individuals who are volunteering. LGBT volunteer, lesbian, gay, and bisexual volunteers are more likely to think about expanding their social networks. So looking in different communities, whereas the straight volunteers, their straight peers, are more likely to cite maintaining their social networks as the important part of their volunteering motivations. And LGBT or LGB volunteers are more likely to expand their social networks. They're more likely to have a diverse friend group. They're more likely to work with people of different ethnic backgrounds and different religious backgrounds during their work than their straight peers. And that's something that they're less likely to feel that they're appreciated, and that's something that's within the direct control of voluntary organizations when they think about how they work with, how they communicate with their volunteer groups, and the environment that they're creating for the volunteers that they are benefiting from ultimately. And then in terms of the policy potential, what we think about how this can impact practice. When we think about increasing contact in divided societies, we kind of have two different options to go about it. One is like what we can think of as a direct option, just direct community integration. We can recruit folks from different backgrounds intentionally, right? So if we think about shared education or some of the like summer sports activities, we want to take folks, we recruit directly from a Protestant football club and a Catholic football club, and we put those two groups together. And the idea is that your community, your religious community, your background is salient to the process. You are recruited based on that identity, and the point of the program is to bring folks of different, separate, identified communities together. And then there's the idea of looking at cross-cutting identities. So instead of going to a Catholic school that is predominantly Catholic and a school that is predominantly Protestant, and recruiting out of those schools for some sort of shared education opportunity, rather, you look at some cross-cutting identity, whether that be gender, sexual orientation, a hobby, or an interest. Fortnite, the video game, doesn't have a strictly Protestant or a strictly Catholic orientation. It's just a video game that many, many young men play. And so the idea with these kinds of programs can be to reduce the salience of community identity and increase the salience of whatever the cross-cutting identity is. This has additional challenges because you don't necessarily know where to find people with these cross-cutting identities in such a easy way. And when you're recruiting folks, you may or may not, you may not be able to strictly say we're getting 50% from Catholic majority schools and 50% from Protestant majority schools. So recruitment can be more challenging, but it's a way of de-emphasizing kind of the predominant community identity for the goal of increasing links along other parts of identity that aren't strictly divided. So just as a last thought, I don't want to be the person between everyone and cake for this, but the idea of building strong communities will require a focus on the big divides in society. In Northern Ireland, that's religious. In the US, that tends to be race and ethnicity. There is going to have to be focus on these big divides, but that doesn't mean we have to ignore some of the smaller bridges that already exist across those communities. And indeed, we can use those smaller bridges as a way to get to those big divides. So, thank you very much.